And hello to everyone watching us online. So good to have you with us. My name is Mads. I'm the 18 to 25 pastor here at St. Swithin's. It is so good to be here with you. Tonight, we will be looking at how can we live a balanced life. We're looking at a series at the moment of reconnecting. And last week, Matt spoke to us about how we can avoid slipping into the old normal, knowing the new things we know now in the new normal. In a time of change, how do we decide what to keep and what to leave behind? How do we know what to take up and what to put down? How do we know what to stand up for and where to start? As life speeds up, how is it that we balance ourselves so that we're living life to the full without living a life that is full meaning, full schedules, and full busyness? If you imagine it this way, look at this mess. Imagine our lives are like this extension plug. When things get busy, we're unable to have a healthy balance. It's like our lives get overloaded. You can see here there is so much going on. Life is busy and it has its daily rhythms, but you can see this doesn't look like life to the full. It looks like a full and messy and overloaded life. The fuses have blown and you are on a short fuse yourself with everything going on. There are also things plugged in here as well that we know shouldn't be because of the negative impact it has on the rest of the things we're choosing to connect to as well. Not everything that we connect ourselves to is good and right, and not all reconnection is good and helpful. I remember when I was growing up, I grew up overseas, and because of the weird electricity, we could never have the kettle on at the same time as the washing machine. Not sure why, I do know why. Because every time we would try to, all the power would go off. There'd be a click and everything would trip out. You're in darkness because these two appliances have such high voltage that it just completely trips out and cannot deal with the overload. So there were options. One option was you could unplug and disconnect everything in the entire house so that these two appliances could run. All the lights, the electrics, the boiler, the fish tank, the fridge and the freezer. This is in a 40-degree climate as well, not what you want to do. And my Game Boy Color charger. If you know how great Game Boy Colors are, or were back in the day, you know it's important. But realistically, that would take an eternity. And by the time you had done that, you'd probably not want a cup of tea anyway. So the real choice was have a cuppa and deal with the stench of sweaty, unlaundered, dirty clothes in a tropical 40-degree climate, or enjoy the fresh scent of Persil Professional Bio Washing Powder and deal with a tough day as a Brit without a brew. Suddenly you're thrown into a choice and you need to prioritize between these two things in order to avoid burnout. And I wonder if that's what can happen to us too. Before we know it, our life is filled with so much, it forces us to make a choice between what to keep and what to lose. I know full well that if my Netflix or my TikTok plug is plugged in, suddenly something else has to be unplugged and something else takes a hit. And so often for me, that is my connection with God that goes first. Very often it's where temptation sneaks in and tells us that if we disconnect from something that is right and healthy physically, mentally, or spiritually, whether that be neighbor hubs, church, time with God, then that will give us the space and energy to plug in something that isn't so helpful, but it looks shiny and tempting and looks like it's life-giving. Sometimes by plugging in something that is such high voltage that we know takes up so much of our time and our life, we find that it is the expense of something else. Philippians gives a bit of a picture of the things that we can make a part of our lives that are a good source of energy and time. It says in Philippians, finally, brothers and sisters, whatever is true, whatever is noble, whatever is right, whatever is pure, whatever is lovely, whatever is admirable, if anything is excellent or praiseworthy, think about such things. How often for you does a connection with something that isn't right or helpful, or any of the things that we read in Philippians creep in and take precedent? How often do we feel disconnected when we seem connected to so much? What does life-giving connection look like? What would it look like to reconnect ourselves to the right and stay disconnected from the wrong? Wrong doesn't even have to be things that seem super unhelpful. Sometimes it's just slipping into old habits that have crept in. Maybe it's apathy towards what's happening in the world, because if it's not to do with my plug and my connection, then why should I bother? But that's exactly the danger, thinking that connection and reconnection are just about ourselves. Part of the beauty of lockdown is that suddenly all of this just seemed to be unplugged, and there was opportunity to rest, not to fill our days and our time just because there's space to, but to strip back and to start again and to decide what it is we want our lives to look like. How is it that we can live life to the full without it looking like a full and busy life? We can work out now how to find this balance between the fear of missing out with what life has to offer, alongside the self-preservation of looking after our minds, our bodies, and our souls. So tonight, I'd love to dive into the Bible in order to help to guide us so we can find out how we can reconnect to the right things, but stay disconnected from the wrong. If you have a Bible with you, I'd encourage you to turn to John 10, verse 1 to 10. I'll give you a second to find it. And this is a passage where we read about the good shepherd being God. It says this: "Very truly I tell you, Pharisees, anyone who does not enter the sheep pen by the gate, but climbs in some other way, is a thief and a robber. The one who enters by the gate is the shepherd of the sheep. The gatekeeper opens the gate for him, and the sheep listen to his voice. He calls his own sheep by name and leads them out. When he has brought out all his own, he goes ahead of them, and his sheep follow him because they know his voice. But they will never follow a stranger. In fact, they run away from him because they do not recognize a stranger's voice." Jesus used this figure of speech, but the Pharisees did not understand what he was telling them. Therefore, Jesus said again, "Very truly, I tell you, I am the gate for the sheep. All who have come before me are thieves and robbers, but the sheep have not listened to them. I am the gate. Whoever enters through me will be saved. They will come in and go out and find pasture. The thief comes only to steal and kill and destroy, but I've come that they may have life and have it to the full." Here Jesus is describing himself as the gatekeeper, the good shepherd who cares for his sheep, who goes ahead of them, who knows them by name. He's provided a safe passage into the sheep pen, and he longs for his sheep to flourish in green, fresh pastures. As his sheep, he offers us life to the full. But this passage doesn't say this just happens by coincidence. There's an active part that we have to play as well. And so there are three things I'd love to look at here that we can do as his sheep in order to ensure we're connecting to what is true, what is noble, whatever is right, whatever is pure, whatever is lovely, whatever is admirable, excellent, and praiseworthy. Three things we can do to reconnect to God, ourselves, and others, knowing that we all have a part to play to help us to reconnect to what is right. And so the first thing we read in verse 3 that the sheep do is they listen to the gatekeeper's voice. In order to reconnect with what is right, we need to listen to the gatekeeper's voice. We need to know what God's voice sounds like. We need to know who God is and who the good shepherd is, so we know what voice to follow. I don't know if you've been watching the BBC show, I Can See Your Voice. Anyone? Don't bother, it's rubbish, it's really bad. But I did once turn it on for 5 minutes, which ended up turning into an hour. It's addictive, I'll give you that. But basically, premises of the show, right, is that you try and work out which contestants can actually sing and which ones are tone deaf. It's very funny. But as part of this show, the contestants mime to a voice. Now, those who can actually sing are miming to their own voice, but those who are completely tone deaf are miming to the voice of someone who can actually sing. The idea is you try and work out whether the voice matches what you know of the person and try and work out if it's their actual voice or not. And it's so frustrating because time and time again, I just got it wrong. Like, I thought the voice seemed to perfectly match what I knew from the hints and descriptions I'd been given. But embarrassing, like so many times, Ruth knows, so many times, I looked round and what had the potential of being an amazing voice was actually this voice of deception. I felt so deceived. And with musical ears, if I don't say so myself, Josh, a voice that ended up being the furthest thing from what I would want to listen to. And it's often the same with the voices we listen to. So often it's easy to hear a voice that we think matches what we know of God, when really it's masked by deception. I wonder how often what we think of ourselves is really so far from the truths of God. We might tell ourselves we don't deserve to be loved because of the mistakes we've made, and so we disconnect from God, when really we know that God so loved the world, God so loved you, that he sent his only son to die for you, that you would have eternal life. It's not just the things we tell ourselves, though. Sometimes the voices of the world bombard us left, right, and center and demand our attention. The world says, connect to this, consume this, join this, buy this, subscribe to this, do this, act like this, morph into this, and then you will find joy, or you will feel accepted, or at home, or safe, or accomplished, or loved, or known. If we connect to what the world demands and consume all the joy from it, if we found everything that looks like it could give us connection and rob it from the world, what would really end up happening is that the world would rob our joy from us before we ever found any sense of true, pure, long-lasting joy, connection, and satisfaction from the world. I found that as lockdown began, the slowing and the stopping caused the voices of the world to quieten. And as life slowed down, there came an opportunity to retune and tune in again to the voice of God. I remember the joy of my daily walk as a chance to daily appreciate the beauty of creation, a daily rhythm of putting work aside for an hour and focusing on the presence of God. The difference it made was unbelievable. And as a church, we did the same. We tuned in again to what God was saying. We shared encouragements with one another. We saw people regularly checking in with their neighbors, really pushing into caring for one another and tuning in again to the voice of God. But I wonder if we're already in danger of losing what was so good. As lockdown began, we lost the old normal, and with the new normal came a chance to reconnect with God and create healthy rhythms to push further into hearing God's voice than ever before. But as life has sped up, I have certainly noticed that those healthy spiritual and physical practices that seemed so easy to create when life slowed down are now in danger of being replaced by a busy and full life rather than life to the full. So in order to live life to the full, firstly, as God's sheep, we need to listen to the right voice. The voice that isn't demanding, it's not demeaning, it's not deceptive, but it's a voice that is true and it's loving and it longs to reconnect with us. If we can reconnect to what's right, we can begin to live a balanced life. Maybe that looks like finding places where you can sit and be with God, where your relationship with him can grow. Maybe it looks like joining a neighbor hub or a small group or getting involved or finding a daily rhythm. Or it might be being filled afresh with his spirit. But secondly, it's great to listen to God, to be able to hear his voice, to hear him speaking to us and challenging us. But what's the point if we don't respond? Our vision at St. Swithin's isn't love, live and sit, love, live and chill. It's love, live and go. Hearing God's voice should stir us into action. We read in John 10 again, the next thing the sheep do is they follow the gatekeeper's voice. In the same way, for us to truly reconnect, we need to follow God's voice. One thing that's been amazing to see within the last year is the move of God's people, the move of humanity, really, towards standing up and disconnecting from our apathy and reconnecting to something new. The reconnection that should have happened decades ago, but it's almost like being able to disconnect from our own lives and our own priorities and our own privilege for a second and reset our connection made us realize it's not just about us. It struck me as these movements began that I'd been apathetic myself. So many things that I didn't even realize were major issues going on in the world. I was just apathetic to. I'd been blinded by focusing so much on my own connection and reconnection that I'd not even considered, that others don't even have the privilege of some of the connections I have. We decided as a small group to dive into what it looks like to be frontline Christians, what it looks like to step forward and step up instead of stepping back or not stepping forwards at all. Listening to God's voice tells us that God is a God who cares for every person, regardless of the things that society creates to demean or to hurt or to victimize certain people, races, gender, or social standing. It's great to know that God is like that and know that from listening to his voice, but it's something different to follow that voice into action. We cannot afford to lose the reconnection that society has woken up to. It is not good enough to disconnect from the fight for injustice. It is not good enough to disconnect from the fight for safety of women on the streets. It is not good enough to disconnect from the fight to be prayer warriors in countries suffering with excruciating levels of COVID. It is not good enough to disconnect from being God's disciples and following his example of telling other people about the good news of who God is and what he has done. I wonder what God has called you to follow him in. Where can you see an area where you can stand up and follow God into action? Follow where he is calling you. Follow the calling he has placed on your heart to reconnect with him. Because in order to truly reconnect and find balance, we need to follow God's voice. And finally, the last thing we read that the sheep do is they flee from the voices they don't recognize. They run away from the voice of a stranger, the voice of thieves, the voice of deception. We really need to disconnect from the things that tell us they give us life, but in reality pull us away from God. It's so easy to get overloaded and overwhelmed with the things the world has to offer, but don't be afraid to ruthlessly eliminate them. Now is the time to disconnect from the deceptive, the unhealthy, and the unwholesome. Right now, what does that look like for you? Does it look like believing the lie that your identity is in work and work alone, or the deception that true acceptance comes from likes and follows, or perhaps it's an addiction to something that has such a hold on your life and forces you to disconnect from what is right and continue to connect to what gives the devil a foothold. But this isn't just a TED talk or a mindfulness session on how to feel like you're living a good and a right life. As Christians, we're called to something greater, to connect to a true life source, a true source of fullness and energy that cannot be found simply in trying to better ourselves alone. We are called to reconnect with God. The extension lead may feel like this plug here. The vital plug of God just squeezed in at the end here and hoping that nothing else gets in the way. But that mindset is exactly the problem, exactly the deception that is dangerous. We assume that God is something extra that we add onto our lives. We have our hobbies and our interests. We have our work. We have our social time with friends. And we have leisure. And before you know it, things are getting so full that suddenly God is squeezed out of the picture again. For some, these things in our lives are causing us to live a compromised life. We're trying to have all these things and other stuff and hold them together, but the Bible is clear. God is a jealous God. The first commandment is so clear. You are to have no other gods before me. We are to flee temptation, flee the things that so easily entangle us and pull us away from God. A bad plug can actually bring the whole house down in flames. Yes, it's hard, but we don't do it on our own. The good news is we just don't. We already know the Good Shepherd leads. He knows our names. We recognize his voice. God leads and guides, and we follow. In reality, without God, so much of who we are, how we live, and what we do is disconnected. It's disconnected from the true source of life, the true source of living water. In order to reconnect with God, we have to understand He's not this add-on that you just add on to the end of what you have time for. He is the main source behind it all. He is the main priority. So to disconnect from the voices that seek to deceive, we need to ensure that we are connected first to Him. God is our priority. Through connection with Him, we are able to be filled with His Spirit. Not a spirit of fear, but a spirit of truth, a spirit of love, a spirit of self-control, so that when the world seeks to tell us what true reconnection is, we can discern through His Spirit what true and real connection is. I want to leave you with a passage from Isaiah 49 in the Message version, because I think it encompasses the why behind reconnection. As we long to see things change and progress with COVID and lockdown, we have a hope beyond it all. We know that God has the victory, but we also know that it is our call as disciples to love, live, and go, to see lives and communities transformed. We long to see a change and a shift. We long to see people come to know and connect to Him. So this passage points to a hope and a future, but it's also true in so many ways for the now. Isaiah 49 says this: God also says, when the time is ripe, I answer you. When victory is due, I help you. I form you and use you to reconnect the people with me, to put the land in order, to resettle families on the ruined properties. I tell prisoners, come on out, you're free, and those huddled in fear, it's all right, it's safe now. There will be food stands along the roads, picnics on the hills, nobody hungry, nobody thirsty, shade from the sun, shelter from the wind, for the compassionate one guides them, takes them to the best springs. I'll make all my mountains into roads, turn them into a superhighway. Look, these coming from far countries and those out of the north, these streaming from the west and those from all the way down the Nile. Heavens raise the roof. Earth, wake the dead. Mountains, send up cheers. God has comforted His people. He has tenderly nursed His beaten up, beaten down people. God sent His Son Jesus to die for you so that we could have a relationship with Him, so that we might be forgiven for all the times we have made mistakes and connected to what is wrong. God knows that there is so much in the world that seeks to try and bring us a full life. But He sent His Son to die so that we might be able to live life to the full, knowing that He is a good shepherd who longs to connect with us. But the question is, will you reconnect with God, yourselves, and others? Will you allow God to use you to reconnect the people with Him?